Welcome back to Chrono Tales, where the familiar becomes frightening and the ordinary hides the extraordinary. I'm your host, and tonight we venture into a story that will make you question every door you've ever walked through. This is the unsettling tale of The Last Door on Elm Street. They say that every neighborhood has its mysteries. But some mysteries are doors that should never be opened. Some mysteries are thresholds that, once crossed, change you forever. And some doors don't lead where you think they do. Detective Sarah Chen had seen enough darkness in her 15 years with the Chicago Police Department to know that some cases follow you home. That's why in March 2023, when she finally received her transfer to the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, she felt like she could breathe again for the first time in years. Millbrook was everything Chicago wasn't. Quiet streets lined with maple trees, neighbors who waved from their porches, and crime statistics that barely registered above traffic violations and noise complaints. It was exactly the kind of place where Sarah hoped to heal from the psychological wounds left by too many violent cases. Her new house at 1247 Elm Street was a modest colonial built in the 1960s, with blue shutters and a small front garden that the previous owners had maintained with obvious care. Sarah had bought it sight unseen, trusting the virtual tour and the glowing recommendation from the local real estate agent. The house felt welcoming from the moment she stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, the hardwood floors gleamed, and there was something indefinably peaceful about the space. Sarah spent her first day unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, feeling more relaxed than she had in months. It wasn't until the evening of her second day that Sarah noticed the door. She was measuring the living room for a bookshelf when she realized there was a door she hadn't opened yet. It was tucked into an alcove near the back of the house, painted the same cream color as the walls, which made it almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Sarah tried the handle, but the door was locked. She checked her ring of keys from the real estate agent, but none of them fit. The door had no exterior hardware except for the handle, and an old-fashioned keyhole that looked original to the house.
Probably just a storage closet they forgot to give me the key for.
Sarah made a mental note to call the real estate agent in the morning and went back to unpacking. But as she worked, she found her eyes drawn back to the door repeatedly. There was something about it that seemed expectant. The next morning, Sarah called Janet Morrison, the agent who had sold her the house.
A locked door? That's odd. Sarah, I don't remember any mention of it in the property disclosure. Let me check my files and call the previous owners. The Hendersons lived there for 32 years. If anyone would know about a locked door, it would be them.
Three hours later, Janet called back with news that only deepened the mystery.
Sarah, I spoke with Robert Henderson. He says there's no locked door in that house. He's lived there since Night 91 and knows every inch of the place. He thinks you might be mistaken.
Janet, I'm looking right at it. It's definitely a door, and it's definitely locked.
Well, that's strange. Would you like me to send someone over to take a look?
No, that's okay. I'll figure it out. Maybe I can pick the lock or something.
Sarah stood in front of the door for a long time that afternoon, studying its details. The wood was definitely original to the house. She could tell by the grain pattern and the way it had aged. But Robert Henderson had lived there for over 30 years and claimed there was no such door. She knocked on the door experimentally. The sound was hollow, suggesting there was definitely space behind it. But when she went outside to look at the exterior of the house, there was no corresponding window or architectural feature that would indicate a room in that location. Sarah measured the exterior wall and compared it to the interior dimensions. According to her calculations, there should be a space approximately 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep behind the door. But from the outside, that space appeared to be part of the neighbor's yard.
This doesn't make sense.
That night, Sarah dreamed about the door. In her dream, she had the key, and when she opened it, she found herself in a room that existed in perpetual twilight. The walls were lined with photographs, but when she tried to look at them directly, the images shifted and changed. She woke at 3:17 a.m. with the absolute certainty that she had heard the door opening and closing. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The door was still closed, still locked, but the air near it felt different, warmer, as if someone had just been standing there. Sarah's police training had taught her to approach mysteries methodically. If there was a logical explanation for the door, she would find it. The next morning, she drove to the Millbrook Town Hall to research the history of 1247 Elm Street. The records clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, was delighted to help. She pulled out manila folders filled with building permits, property transfers, and architectural plans dating back to the house's construction in 1963.
Here we are. Built by Hartwell Construction for the original owners, David and Ruth Mackenzie. Let's see. Standard 3-bedroom colonial. 1,800 square feet. Full basement. Attached garage.
Are there any architectural plans that show interior doors?
Oh yes, dear. The building permit application requires detailed floor plans.
The architectural plans showed exactly what Sarah expected to see. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, kitchen, living room, dining room, and basement. There was no indication of any additional room or door in the location where Sarah had found the mysterious entrance.
Mrs. Patterson, Have there been any renovation permits filed for this address? Any additions or modifications?
Let me check the modification files. No, dear. The only permits on file are for a new water heater in 1987 and a roof repair in 2003. Nothing that would involve interior changes.
Sarah thanked Mrs. Patterson and drove to the Millbrook Public Library to research the history of Elm Street itself. What she found in the local history section made her skin crawl. According to a 1975 article in the Millbrook Gazette, Elm Street had been built over the site of the old Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, which had operated from 1923 to 1962. The hospital had been demolished to make way for suburban development, but not before gaining a reputation as one of the most troubled mental health facilities in Connecticut. The article described numerous scandals, patient abuse, experimental treatments, suspicious deaths. In 1961, a patient named Thomas Whitmore had disappeared from the hospital. His body was never found, and the case had never been solved. Sarah photocopied the article and several related pieces, including a detailed map showing the exact location of the hospital buildings. When she overlaid the old map with a modern street map, she discovered that 1247 Elm Street sat directly on the site of the hospital's isolation ward. That evening, Sarah called her former partner in Chicago, Detective Mike Rodriguez. Mike had always been more open to unconventional explanations than most cops.
Sarah, how's small-town life treating you?
Mike, I need to ask you something, and I need you to take me seriously. Have you ever encountered anything in your cases that couldn't be explained by conventional means?
You mean like supernatural stuff? What's going on, Sarah?
Sarah told Mike about the door, the building records, and the hospital history. To his credit, Mike listened without interrupting or dismissing her concerns.
Sarah, I've seen some weird stuff over the years. Things that didn't make it into official reports because no one would believe them. If you think something's not right, trust your instincts.
So what do I do?
Document everything. Take photos, measurements, notes. And maybe try to find out more about this Thomas Whitmore guy.
Sarah spent the rest of the evening researching Thomas Whitmore online. What she found was disturbing but incomplete. Whitmore had been committed to Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital in 1959 for what records described as severe dissociative episodes and claims of supernatural experiences. According to newspaper archives, Whitmore had told doctors that he could see doors that others couldn't see, and that he could step between rooms that existed in different times. The doctors had dismissed his claims as delusions, but Sarah found herself wondering if Thomas Whitmore had seen something very similar to what she was seeing now. That night, Sarah set up a camera pointed at the door before going to bed. If something was happening while she slept, she wanted evidence. Sarah woke at 4:23 a.m. to the sound of her camera's motion detector alarm. She grabbed her phone and checked the live feed. The door was open. Sarah crept downstairs, her heart pounding. The door stood wide open, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. Cold air flowed from the opening, carrying with it a smell she recognized from her years in law enforcement, the institutional smell of old hospitals and forgotten places. She approached the door slowly, flashlight in hand. The beam penetrated only a few feet into the darkness before being swallowed completely. But she could hear something from beyond the threshold, a steady, rhythmic sound like machinery running in the distance.
Hello? Is someone there?
Sarah stood at the threshold for nearly 10 minutes, torn between her police training that told her to investigate and her survival instincts that screamed at her to close the door and walk away. Finally, curiosity won. The moment Sarah stepped through the door, the world changed around her. The mechanical humming became louder, and she could make out the sound of voices, distant conversations, crying, occasional shouts. The air was thick and humid like a hospital ward in summer. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed a long corridor with institutional green walls and worn linoleum floors. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, each marked with a number and a small observation window. She was standing in what appeared to be the psychiatric ward of a functioning hospital. But this wasn't possible. The hospital had been demolished in 1962. Sarah checked her watch. It was 4:30 a.m. on March 15, 2023. Yet around her, she could hear the unmistakable sounds of a busy medical facility in operation.
Dr. Richardson to Ward 7. Dr. Richardson to Ward 7.
Sarah walked slowly down the corridor, peering through the observation windows. In some rooms, she could see patients lying in beds or sitting in chairs, staring at walls. In others, the rooms appeared empty. But in one room, she saw something that made her freeze. A man sat in the corner of the room, writing frantically in a notebook. He looked to be in his 30s with dark hair and intense eyes. When he looked up and saw Sarah watching through the window, he smiled and held up his notebook, pointing to something he had written. Sarah moved closer to the window to read what he had written. In large, clear letters, the notebook page read, "Sarah Chen, you found the door." The man in the room mouthed words that Sarah could somehow hear, despite the thick glass between them.
I'm Thomas Whitmore. I've been waiting for someone else who could see the doors.
How do you know my name?
Time works differently here, Sarah. I've seen you coming for weeks. The doors show us things. Past, present, future. Sometimes all at once.
Suddenly, the hospital alarm system began blaring. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and Sarah could hear running footsteps approaching from both directions.
Patient in Ward 7 is missing. Security to Ward 7.
Sarah, You have to go, now, but come back tomorrow night. There's something you need to understand. About the doors.
Sarah ran back toward the entrance, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Behind her, she could hear voices getting closer, and the sound of doors being opened and slammed shut as hospital staff searched for the missing patient. She reached the door she had entered through and dove back into her own house. The moment she crossed the threshold, the sounds of the hospital cut off abruptly, replaced by the familiar silence of her living room. Sarah spun around to look back through the door, but all she saw was darkness. She grabbed the door handle and pulled it shut, her hands shaking. She spent the rest of the night sitting in her living room, staring at the door and trying to convince herself that what had happened was just a very vivid dream. But when she checked her camera footage in the morning, she could clearly see herself walking through the open door at 4:28 a.m. and returning at 4:52 a.m. Sarah spent the entire next day researching Thomas Whitmore more thoroughly. What she discovered painted a picture of a man who had been far from delusional. Before his commitment to Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, Thomas had been a respected physicist working on experimental research for the government. His academic papers, published in obscure scientific journals, dealt with theoretical concepts about parallel dimensions and temporal displacement. His colleagues had described him as brilliant, but obsessed with the idea that reality was far more malleable than most people understood. According to his medical records, which Sarah obtained through her law enforcement connections, Thomas had been committed after he began claiming that he could step between different versions of the same location, and that he had discovered doorways that existed outside normal space-time. The records showed that Thomas had been subjected to experimental treatments, including sensory deprivation and early forms of electroshock therapy. The doctors had been trying to cure him of what they considered dangerous delusions. But what if Thomas hadn't been delusional at all?
Dr. Martinez? This is Detective Sarah Chen. I need to ask you about theoretical physics, specifically about the possibility of, doorways between dimensions.
Detective, that's a very interesting question. Are you familiar with the concept of quantum entanglement and parallel realities?
Dr. Martinez, a physics professor at Yale University, explained that modern quantum theory did allow for the possibility of parallel dimensions existing simultaneously with our own reality.
In theory, Detective, if certain conditions were met, specific electromagnetic fields, emotional trauma, or other catalytic events, it might be possible for these parallel realities to intersect briefly.
What kind of catalytic events?
Locations with intense emotional history, for one. Places where trauma has occurred repeatedly might create, let's call them weak points in the barrier between realities.
That evening, Sarah prepared more carefully for her second journey through the door. She packed a bag with bottled water, a camera, extra flashlight batteries, and a voice recorder. If she was going to document this impossible experience, she would do it thoroughly. At exactly midnight, Sarah positioned herself in front of the door and waited. At 12:17 a.m., she heard the familiar sound of the lock disengaging on its own. This time, the corridor beyond the door was different. The institutional green walls were there, but the lighting was dimmer, and she could hear different sounds. Not the bustling activity of a functioning hospital, but something quieter and more ominous. Sarah walked directly to the room where she had seen Thomas Whitmore the night before. He was there, sitting in the same corner, but he looked older, more haggard.
Sarah, I knew you'd come back. How long has it been for you?
About 18 hours. But you look like you've aged years.
Time moves differently in each iteration of this place. Sometimes I experience days and minutes. Sometimes minutes stretch into months. The doors connect different versions of the same location, but they exist in different time streams.
Thomas held up his notebook again. This time, it contained detailed drawings of door after door, each labeled with dates and locations.
I've been mapping them, Sarah, the doors. They appear in places where reality has been damaged. Traumatic events, intense emotions, repeated suffering. They create cracks in the fabric of space-time.
How many doors are there?
Hundreds, maybe thousands. They're appearing more frequently now. Something is happening to the barriers between realities.
Thomas showed Sarah drawings of doors in hospitals, prisons, old houses, abandoned buildings, all places, where people had suffered or died under traumatic circumstances.
But here's what you need to understand. Sarah, the doors aren't just showing us different places. They're showing us different possibilities. Different outcomes for the same events.
What do you mean?
In some realities, I was never committed to this hospital. In others, I died here decades ago. In some, the hospital was never built. The doors let us see all of these possibilities simultaneously.
Suddenly, the sound of screaming echoed down the corridor. But this wasn't the controlled chaos of a functioning hospital. This was raw terror.
Sarah, you need to leave now. This iteration is collapsing.
What about you?
I can't leave, Sarah. I've been here too long. I'm part of this place now. But you can still get out.
The hospital around them began to shake and distort. Walls flickered between different time periods, sometimes the clean institutional, green of the 1960s, sometimes water-stained and crumbling, as if the building had been abandoned for decades.
Sarah, before you go, the door in your house isn't the only one. There are others opening in Millbrook. You have to find them and close them before it's too late.
How do I close them?
The same way they opened, and with understanding and acceptance. But be careful. Some doors lead to realities where very bad things happened.
Sarah ran back through the collapsing corridor as the hospital disintegrated around her. She dove through the door just as the ceiling began to cave in behind her. The next morning, Sarah began systematically searching Millbrook for other doors. Using her police credentials, she gained access to older buildings throughout the town, looking for architectural anomalies similar to what she had found in her own house. She found the second door in the basement of the old Millbrook Elementary School, which had been built in 1965 on the site of the hospital's children's ward. The door was hidden behind a boiler, painted to match the concrete walls around it. The third door was in the back room of Morrison's hardware store, which occupied the ground floor of a building that had once housed the hospital's administrative offices. Mr. Morrison, the elderly owner, was shocked when Sarah showed him the door.
Detective, I've owned this store for 40 years, and I've never seen that door before in my life.
The fourth door was the most disturbing. Sarah found it in the Millbrook Community Center, in a storage room that should have been too small to contain an additional exit. When she opened this door at 2 a.m., she found herself in a version of the hospital, where the experiments on patients had never stopped. In this reality, the Millbrook Psychiatric hospital was still operational in 2023, but it had evolved into something far worse than it had been in the 1960s. Sarah saw patients subjected to procedures that were clearly torture, conducted by doctors who seemed to have lost all sense of humanity. She didn't stay long in that reality. The sight of what humanity could become when empathy was completely abandoned was too much to bear. But as she retreated back through the door, she heard Thomas Whitmore's voice calling to her from somewhere in that hellish facility.
Sarah, the doors are multiplying. You have to close them before they destabilize everything.
Sarah spent the next week documenting every door she found in Millbrook. There were 12 in total, each leading to a different version of the Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, each showing a different possibility for how events could have unfolded. In some realities, the hospital had been a genuine place of healing. In others, it had become a research facility for government experiments. In the worst ones, it had evolved into something that could only be described as a factory for human suffering. But the most disturbing discovery was that the doors were becoming more active. They were opening on their own more frequently, and Sarah began to encounter other people who had stumbled through them, confused residents of Millbrook, who found themselves lost in realities that weren't quite their own.
Mrs. Patterson, you said you came home and your husband didn't recognize you?
He keeps insisting that we never had children, Detective. But I have photographs of our daughter right here on the mantelpiece. Something is very wrong.
Sarah realized that the barriers between realities were breaking down. People were accidentally stepping through doors and returning to realities that were slightly different from the ones they had left. The small changes were accumulating, threatening to unravel the fabric of Millbrook entirely. She called Dr. Martinez again, this time with specific questions about quantum entanglement and reality stabilization.
Detective, what you're describing sounds like a cascade failure in the quantum barriers between parallel universes. If it's really happening, the effects could spread far beyond your small town.
How do I stop it?
Theoretically, you'd need to find the source, the original point of trauma that created the first crack, and somehow heal it. But Detective, we're talking about theoretical physics here. I'm not sure it's actually possible.
Sarah knew what she had to do. She had to go back to the original door, back to Thomas Whitmore, and find a way to heal the trauma that had started it all. On her final journey through the door at 1247 Elm Street, Sarah brought something different. A thick folder containing everything she had learned about Thomas Whitmore's life before his commitment to the hospital. She found Thomas in his room, but this time he wasn't alone. Around him sat the translucent, figures of other patients from the hospital, people who had died or disappeared over the decades, but whose spirits remained trapped in this intersection of realities.
Sarah, you came back. Do you have it?
I have everything, Thomas. Your research, your academic papers, the letter from your colleague, Dr. Harrison, confirming that your theoretical work was groundbreaking, not delusional.
Sarah read aloud from Thomas's scientific papers, explaining how his work on parallel dimensions had been decades ahead of its time. She showed him newspaper clippings about other scientists who had later confirmed his theories. Most importantly, she read him the letter from his research partner, admitting that Thomas had been committed not because he was mentally ill, but because their government sponsors had been afraid of the implications of his discoveries.
They were afraid. They didn't understand that I was trying to help people, not hurt them.
Thomas, you weren't crazy. You were right. About everything. The doors, the parallel realities, the possibility of moving between them. Modern physics has proven that you were decades ahead of your time.
As Sarah spoke, the other spirits in the room began to fade peacefully, their own traumas healed by the recognition that they had not deserved their suffering. One by one, they found their way to whatever came next.
Sarah, the doors are closing because you helped us understand the truth. But there's one more thing you need to know.
What is it?
You weren't chosen randomly. You're here because you have the ability to see the doors. There are others like us, Sarah, people who can perceive the cracks in reality. And there are more doors opening in other places.
Thomas began to fade as well, but his final words were clear and urgent.
Find the others, Sarah. Help them understand. The doors will keep opening until all the old traumas are healed.
Sarah walked back through the door for the last time. When she turned around, the door was gone. Nothing remained but blank wall. Over the following weeks, all 12 doors in Millbrook closed permanently. The reality distortion stopped, and the confused residents gradually forgot their experiences with parallel worlds. But Sarah remembered everything. Six months later, Detective Sarah Chen received a call from a police department in Portland, Oregon. They had a case involving impossible architecture, doors that appeared and disappeared, leading to places that shouldn't exist. Sarah packed her bags, knowing that Thomas Whitmore had been right. There were others who needed help understanding that they weren't crazy. That reality was far stranger and more wonderful than most people dared to believe. And somewhere in the space between realities, the spirits of those who had suffered in the Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital finally found peace, knowing that their stories had been heard and their pain acknowledged. That concludes tonight's journey into the impossible. Remember, the next time you encounter a door that doesn't quite belong, ask yourself, what trauma might it be trying to heal? What truth might it be trying to tell? Thank you for joining me in exploring the mysteries that exist, just beyond our everyday perception. Until next time, keep your mind open to possibilities, and your heart ready to heal old wounds.